This is the third in our series of webinars this year. We've got 3 more coming up in the summer, and we already did 2 recordings for those webinars are available on the SAM website, and we are also recording this session, and we'll post recordings on the webinars page of the SAM website. So today we're going to talk about distributed residential and commercial projects. I'll define some terms, and then we'll talk about load and weather data, electricity rate inputs, bill savings, and how those savings affect the project cash flow. And I'll quickly show you a macro we have for rate switching scenarios, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. If you do have questions as I'm speaking, please use the questions box in the webinar widget, and my colleagues Janine and Steve and Nick will be helping answer those questions as I speak. And then if we do have time at the end, which I hope to, then we can have some follow-up discussion. All right, so SAM's residential and commercial financial models, and we also have a third-party model that falls under this category, are distributed energy system models. So this means that the renewable energy system is on the customer side of the electricity meter and thus interacts with the load. And so to model such a system, we need a model for the renewable energy system, which is the performance model in SAM. And then we need data about the electricity consumption of the building. And we need a description of the utility rate structure to model sales and purchases of grid electricity. And then a financial model that takes the value of the electricity savings from the renewable energy system and uses it in a cash flow model to calculate financial metrics that you can use for project decision making. There are lots of different ways for distributed energy systems to be compensated for the electricity they generate. And SAM can model all of the scenarios that I've show up here. So in some cases, the electricity customer might be credited for excess generation. So if the renewable energy system produces more electricity than is required by the building, then the customer receives a credit on their electricity bill. There's also some situations where the electricity customer is not allowed to generate more electricity than the load. That's sometimes called self-consumption. You can model those scenarios in SAM, although you have to size the system yourself to ensure that doesn't happen. SAM won't prevent the system from generating excess electricity. So you have to look at the results to make sure that no power is going to the grid in that case. There's also feed-in tariffs of various types where you essentially are selling the electricity, the excess electricity generated by the system at some rate. And then it's also possible to have an arrangement where some entity purchases all of the electricity from the renewable energy system regardless of the load, and then the electricity customer buys the electricity to meet the building load from the grid. So in order to model these types of scenarios in SAM, we need to provide SAM with information about the electricity load. So I'll start there. This is the SAM welcome page, what you see when you first start SAM. And for this demonstration, I'll start a new project. And I'm going to use the photovoltaic detailed model, but I could also use the wind model or PV watts model or any of these other performance models that can be coupled to either the residential, commercial, or third-party ownership financial model. I'll start with a residential photovoltaic system that creates a case, and I'm going to rename this case residential PV default. So this is our default PV system. I assume most of you have worked in SAM and so are familiar with the tabs along the left side that give you access to the different input pages. And this is for a description of the renewable energy system, which we won't be talking about today, but will in webinars later this summer. And we've got cost data to define the cost of the system. So this is installation and operating costs. And then financial parameters for the financial model, so debt and taxes and that sort of thing. Any incentives. And then what we're going to be talking about today is the electricity rates page and the electric load page. So I'll start with the load. So electric load, this is the electricity consumption of either a residential home or a commercial building or a commercial facility. In this case, it's a house. And we have a summary of the default load data. So there's some load data populated on this page by default. And the monthly totals for this load data are shown here. And then this is the peak, monthly peak. So the maximum load value in each month is shown here. So the peak load would be used to calculate demand charges, and the energy values would be used to calculate energy charges on the bill. We can take a look at the underlying hourly data here by clicking View Load Data. So here is January through December. I can see there's a big summer peak. I think this is for a home in Phoenix, Arizona, so a big air conditioning load in the summer. We can look at the data in lots of different formats. So here's a heat map that shows that same data. You can very clearly see where the summer peak load is. And you see the variation throughout the day and year on this heat map. And we have other ways of looking at the data here. So this data came from the table that you see when you click Edit Data. So here is the 8760 data that is in SAM by default. If you have your own hourly load data, you can import it into SAM from this window. So you click the Import button. And you want to format a text file like this one. So it should have a single header row at the top. So row 1 is some text that SAM ignores. And then rows 2 through 8761 are the load data. And these are kilowatt per hour values in this case for hourly data. Then you just click Import, and that loads the data from the text file into this table. And then you click OK, and it brings it into SAM. In some cases, you may have sub-hourly load data, for example, 15-minute or 10-minute load data. If you're doing any kind of demand charge analysis, you usually want to use sub-hourly load data. So to do that, you change time step. You put 15 minutes here if you had 15-minute data, and then that adds rows into this table. So you have 4 time steps per hour. And then you would import or export, or you can copy and paste data in as well. If you're pasting data from a spreadsheet or something, you click this column heading and then press Control-V to copy data in from your clipboard. Once you have your load data, then there are a couple of tools that you can use to make adjustments to that load data. So typically, the only information that you have about your customer's electricity usage is the total monthly usage that's provided on monthly utility bills. So you might use an hourly data set like this one to sort of define the general shape of the load. So this shows us that we have a big summer peak. And you can see the daily shape in more detail by zooming in. So you can maintain this general load shape, but scale it up or down by month to match the data on an electricity bill. So if the electricity bill says that they used 100 kilowatt hours in January and 238 or 235 in February and 560 in March and so on, you would just type those values in this table, then click OK, and you'll see these totals and peaks change in the table. And if you look at the data in the graph, you'll see two sets of data now. One is the underlying data, which is in blue, and then here's the data scaled up or down. And you can very clearly see that all the January data was scaled down to match my lower monthly total, and February, and so on. So that's one way that you can adjust the underlying load data. The other way is just to use a single scaling factor. So here, instead of scaling the monthly, that profile by month, we just scale the whole thing up or down. So if I just want to double the load, maintain that load profile, but make it twice as big, then I type 2 here, and then I can see that the orange is twice as much as the blue. So the scale data that Sam's going to use in the simulation is twice as much as the underlying data. Another option, if you don't have time series load data to use, is you can use the load calculator that comes with SAM. So what this does is it takes a very basic description of the building. This only works for residential buildings. You give it floor area, year built, some information about the major appliances, heating and cooling set points, and then here's your monthly utility bill data. And SAM then synthesizes a load profile based on those parameters. And now it takes data from the weather file. So if you go to the location and resource page, we happen to be working with the Phoenix TMY2 weather file here. We'll look at this more in a moment. But this load calculator takes the weather data from that weather file and these parameters and makes some calculations to come up with a load profile. So if you use this method, be sure to take a look at your data and make sure that it looks reasonable. This is just a calculated estimate of what the load might be. Obviously, the best thing to do is to work with some sort of measured data. You can sometimes find data, some utilities post sort of aggregate data for different building types on their website, so you might be able to use that data as the base profile and then scale it up or down. Or you might be able to get, if you're lucky, measured data from residents, depending on the utility and what kind of data they provide to their customers. And there's one more adjustment to talk about on the load page before we move on, and that is the annual adjustment. So by default, or at least when this load growth rate is 0, SAM assumes that the load remains constant over the life of the system. So on the financial parameters page, you tell SAM what the project lifetime is. It's a 25-year project here, so the cash flow is going to be calculated over a 25-year period. And if you want to model, for example, a 1% growth rate, maybe for whatever reason the residential load might be growing over time. You can also use the schedule. If you click this blue and gray button, change from value to SCHED, schedule. That changes the input to an edit button. Click edit, and then you can put in growth rate by year. So maybe the load's going to stay steady for the first 5 years, but after year 6, it's going to grow by 1%. So if you use this table, then this percentage applies to the year 1 value of the load. And you can look at the help system to see more about this. So you can model an annual adjustment whether you use the load calculator or whether you use your own data. One thing to keep in mind is if you do include load growth in your analysis, is that the load growth and the system degradation work together to affect the value of the electricity savings that you're calculating. So on the lifetime input page, there's this degradation rate. And for a PV system, by default, it's 0.5% per year. And that's intended to account for the degradation of the modules over time. So you expect the PV output to decrease slightly every year as the modules get older. And if the load is increasing every year, then those two factors are going to work together to determine what the electricity savings are on a year-by-year basis. The weather data describes the solar resource and ambient temperature and wind speeds that can have an effect on the, or that do have an effect on the heating and cooling loads of a building. So you should always make sure that the load data that you're using is consistent with the weather data you're using. So you wouldn't want to use a southern desert climate load profile with a weather data for the Pacific Northwest, where the load patterns are completely different. So make sure that your load data and weather data are consistent. And if you do use 15-minute load data, you need to, or sub-hourly load data, you need to make sure that the weather data time step matches your load data time step. If you don't have access to sub-hourly sub-hourly weather data, you can use a macro that's available on the sample files page of the SAM website. This macro here allows you to convert an hourly weather file to 15 minutes. So you can download that macro and then open it. It's a script, not a macro. So I'm going to open this script. Should be in my, here it is. And then this is just some code in SAM's built-in LK scripting language that takes the weather file data, chops each hour into 4 15-minute chunks, and then replicates the hourly data on a 15-minute basis. So it will work for a first cut look at demand charge analysis using 15-minute load data, for example. And you can modify this script to convert to different time steps or to use a different algorithm for the conversion if you like. The other thing I'll mention is that by default, if you download a weather file from the NREL NSRDB, which in general we recommend over using these built-in files, you can, this will download hourly data from the NSRDB. You can download either typical year data or single year data. But if you go to the NSRDB website itself and download the data from there, you can download 30-minute data. So if you use this website to download the data, then you can get 30-minute data instead of hourly data. So if you have 30-minute load data, then you're in luck because you can get weather data from the NSRDB. So we've looked at the residential load. All right, so we've downloaded our weather file there. Let's look at the commercial load for a minute. There's a couple of differences between residential and commercial loads. So this is the commercial PV default. And I go to the load page, and you'll see that there's no load calculator here for the commercial load. So that load calculator, as I mentioned before, is for residential buildings only. For the commercial load, we have a macro that you can use to download commercial load data from a DOE data set. So this is hosted on the OpenEI website, which is an NREL website for sharing data and information. And the way this macro works is it looks at the latitude and longitude of your weather file and then goes to this database and finds the load profile that for the location closest to your weather file location, and then downloads the file for whatever type of commercial building you choose from this list. So if you've got a school, you choose school. Make sure that the location file here, the weather file, is for the location of the school, and then run the macro. And this is going out to the OpenEI database, and it just downloaded the data and then populated the load profile on the electric load page with that data from that database. So for commercial buildings, you can use the macro if you don't have your own, if you don't have measured data or your own data to use. All right, so that is all on load data. Janine or Steve, are there any burning load questions that we should address before I move on to the electricity rate inputs?
I'm not seeing any in the chat box.
All right. Thank you. So the electricity rates page is where you tell Sam about the rate structure. And there's information here about how to account for excess generation, and then fixed categories for fixed and minimum charges, energy charges, and demand charges. I'll switch back over to the residential case just for fun. Now the rate schedule data comes from documents like this called rate sheets that are published by the electric utilities. And you'll see that the data on these rate sheets doesn't look a whole lot like the data in SAM. There's quite a bit of data processing that has to happen to convert this data into the numbers in SAM. So the inputs in SAM are designed to be complete enough that we can model most features in a rate sheet. Although there are some things like ratcheting demand rates that aren't supported yet, that will be in a future version of SAM. And just to take a simple example, if we looked at the fixed charge here, that's just one input in SAM called fixed charge that has to accommodate all of the different charges that you'll see on a rate sheet. The rate sheet will typically have, this one has a basic service charge, and then it has some transmission charges and delivery charges. So all of these get added into that one category in SAM. And these are given per day, so you'd have to convert these into per month values, because SAM only has an input for fixed charge per month. So as I say, a bit of work required converting the rate sheet information into inputs for SAM. Luckily, there's an online database that has rate data for many utilities in the U.S. and also some other countries, which will save you some work. So the data has been processed from the rate sheets into this data structure that SAM can read. So to get to that database, you click Search for Rates here. And it just generated a list of all of the utility companies that are available in the database. And we can filter this list by typing in a zip code here or a name, a keyword. So I'll just type in Pacific here, and then you click the name of the utility in this list, and now this gives us a list of all of the rate structures that are available for that utility. And here we're looking only at the residential rates because we came to this window from a residential case, but we can also look at commercial rate structures or a complete list of all the rate structures available for that utility. Now, each of the rate structures in the database has a start and an end date. And so we can filter this list to show only rate structures that have no end date, which means that they're still active. So if you want to use the latest version of a rate, then click Show Active. And then you can use the filter here to filter the list if you have a long list by typing a few letters. When you click the rate structure name here, then you're ready to go. You download and apply the utility rate, and that data was populated in the SAM inputs from the database, from the online database. There's in this description and applicability panel on the electricity rates page is a bunch of information that SAM doesn't use for the bill calculations, but might be useful to peruse before you carry on with your analysis. Sometimes there's some useful information here in the description box, but it also has this URL, which is a link to the document, the original rate sheet that was used to develop this data. So that's a useful resource if you want to check the data in the database against what's actually on the data sheet. Now, the excess generation options here are not part of the rate sheet. That's usually determined by a separate set of regulations, maybe the state regulatory entities or someone else is deciding whether net metering is available in a particular to a particular utility and so on. So it's up to you after you've downloaded your rate data or entered it in manually to choose an appropriate option for the excess generation accounting. Now there's pretty detailed descriptions of these options in help, but I'll try to sort of summarize them here for you. So excess generation can be either calculated on a monthly basis or on a time step basis. So for a monthly basis, we take the total PV generation over the month. So we add up the hourly or sub-hourly kilowatt output of the system and come up with a monthly kilowatt hour value. And we compare that to the total monthly load, and the difference is the excess generation. So that's monthly excess calculation. Hourly excess calculation means we take the, in each time step, we look at the system output and the load and calculate the excess generation on an hour-by-hour basis, and then add those numbers up to come up with the total monthly excess generation. If your rate structure has time of use periods, then we keep track of the excess, the monthly excess by time of use period as well. And then this all generation sold and all load purchased is the option I described at the very beginning, where you're just selling all of the power generated by the system at a sell rate and buying all of the power required to meet the load at a buy rate. So there's no calculating excess generation. We can look at how this excess generation is being calculated in the results. So we're looking at monthly total excess rolled over to next month bill in kilowatt hours, which is typically called net metering. If I run a simulation and go to the Data Tables tab and then click Monthly Data and look at these excess generation kilowatt hour outputs, this shows the how those net metering credits basically are calculated, how the monthly kilowatt hour calculation is done. If you're using this this option where you're rolling over dollars instead of kilowatt hours, so you calculate the excess generation, assign it a dollar value, and then credit the next month bill with dollars instead of kilowatt hours, then those calculations are shown here with this excess generation dollar credit once you run a simulation. And then for the hourly calculation, those you can see, you can look in the time series data and look at the, let's see, the system power generated, compare that to the load, and then look at the sales purchases with system. And if you zoom in, you can see, let's see, I'll put this on a different graph to make it clear. You can see how the load and generation are interacting on an hour-by-hour basis to determine the sales and purchases. And then typically you'll see at the end of the month a big spike, which is most likely a demand charge in this case. All right, so that's excess generation. Now let's look at the the actual rate structure. So the first thing to look at is the fixed and minimum charges. And I have a slide here that will show that a little clearer. So this table down here is monthly outputs from the results page, and I'm showing the energy bill component. So we've got the total bill, we have energy charge, demand charge, and here's a fixed monthly charge. So if the fixed monthly charge here is $16.68 per month, then that gets added into the monthly bill as a fixed charge. The minimum charge means that if the total electricity bill comes to something less than, in this case, $50, then we have to add the difference to the bill so that the bill is $50. So that's what that looks like in the results. The energy charge, let's see, I'm going to reset this to the default. All right, so this, in this particular case, we have, so the energy charges, or the energy rate determines what the energy charge is in the monthly bill. So in this case, we have an energy charge with 4 time of use periods. The period numbers here are associated with the numbers in the matrices. We have, it looks like a peak and off-peak period. And so period 1 is the peak summer period, and period 3 is the peak winter period. And then the off-peak period is period 2 and 4. And we can see from the weekend matrix that the peak periods only apply to the weekday for this particular rate structure. Now, I could model a simpler rate structure. Let's say I just want to model a flat rate. So I don't need 4 entries in the table. I just need 1 row in the table. And I just have 1 period. And let's say that the buy rate is 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And I'm doing monthly total excess rolled over, so I only need a buy rate. Now, if I run a simulation now, I get this strange error message. Period 3 is in month 0, but is not defined in the energy rate table. Rates for each period in the weekday and weekend schedules must be defined in the energy rate table. Oof, okay. Well, that is just telling me that there's 4 time of use periods defined in the tables here, but I only have 1 in the table. So I forgot to change the matrices to match my energy charge table. So let's change that. So I just selected the entire matrix, and then I type a 1 on the keyboard. Instructions for this are in help. If you need to type a number bigger than 10 or bigger than 9, then use A, B, and C. So A for 10, B for 11, and C for 12. Okay, so now I have a simple flat rate structure. I'm going to change my fixed charge to $10, and I have a simple flat energy rate. And then let's look at demand charge. So, and I guess I should mention, you can turn off. Right. So for the demand charge, you got to check the box to enable the demand charges. And we can define demand charges either by month or by time of use period. So the demand charge is calculated for each month, regardless of which option you choose. But you might have, let's say, a summer-only demand charge that applies only in June, July, and August. So that's how you would model that situation. Let's say that in July there's also 2 tiers. So we add another row to the table, and then I can change this month to July, add a second tier. Its maximum is going to be 1e to the 38, which is just a very big number, the biggest number that Sam can deal with. And then the first tier, let's say that anything up to 100 kilowatts peak, I pay a $10 charge, and then if my peak goes above 100 kilowatts, then it's $15 per kilowatt for July only. Okay, so that's how you'd set that up, and you can set up tiers for each month in that same way. Over here is demand rates by time of use period. So if we zero all of these guys out, and just put in a $10 demand charge here. So this is a demand charge that applies in every month throughout the year. So that's a basic one. But we could say, well, maybe maybe you get charged a really big demand charge if you have a peak during these peak summer months during the weekday. So we add another row to the table. Period 2, no tiers in this case, and you're gonna get charged $50 for that per kilowatt for that period. Okay, so when you specify demand charges in both of these tables, they both apply simultaneously, and there are some rate structures that out there that's convoluted. So you can really model a wide range of different demand charge structures, from just a simple flat one to one with complicated time of use and tiers. So let's see, I think for my example here, I just want to have a $10 demand charge that's constant. This is okay, everything's 0. So this is, oh, and I better make, there. All right, so I've got a demand charge, an energy charge, and a fixed charge. And if I run my simulation and want to see how the electricity bill is calculated, I can go to the monthly tab, and I'm going to filter this to show only variables with system in the name, and I'm only interested in monthly data. Okay, so here's my total bill, and then there's my demand charge, my energy charge, and my fixed charge. So with any luck, this bill should be the sum of these values. And I can see there's no energy charge, which must mean that I'm getting credits. So if we want to look at the credits, we can add those to the table. Look at these excess generation credits, which are there. So you can create these tables, and then you can send them to Excel to use them there or to verify calculations. You can also, if you're using a Mac, you'll have to copy this to a clipboard and then open your spreadsheet file separately and then paste it in there, because send to Excel only works in Windows. All right, so how does all of this affect the project cash flow? If we look at the cash flow, we see here at the top is the energy production, and then we see this thing called value of electricity savings, and then all of sort of what we're used to seeing in a pro forma cash flow. various costs and taxes and incentives and so on. And then at the very bottom, these after-tax annual costs and cash flow. So SAM considers the difference between the annual electricity bill with the renewable energy system and without the energy system to be the value of the savings. So you're assuming that the system is saving the electricity customer money on their electricity bill. And that's shown on the summary tab here. We can see the bill without system and the bill with system. And let me get my nifty slide here. So the net savings is the difference between the without system and the with system, and that is the savings in year 1. And then the savings vary from year to year depending on the system degradation and inflation and any escalation rates that you've specified. And then the cost of energy and net present value and payback period are then calculated based on these after-tax cost flows and cash flows that are down at the bottom of the cash flow. Okay, and then one last thing I wanted to show you before we open for question and answer, and that is there may be situations where the with and without system scenarios modeled in this way aren't accurate. So, for example, if you have a residential customer who pays a flat rate for their electricity, and then they want to install a PV system, and if they install the PV system, then they're going to use a fancy time of use rate, and so the with system would use a rate structure with time of use charges, and the without system would just be a flat rate. Well, SAM can't do that as it is, I guess, because we only have one set of inputs for the electricity rates page. We don't have a with and without system option here. But we do have a macro that will run this scenario for you. So if you go to the macros page, click macros here under simulate, and look at the value of RE system macro. What this does is it allows you to choose a different rate structure for the without system scenario. So the with system scenario uses the rate structure from the electricity rates page, and the without system scenario uses the rate structure that you define here. So you can either have it be the same as PV, which is what SAM does by default. You can enter a simple flat rate, so maybe it's 9 cents per kilowatt hour with a $15 fixed monthly charge. And then if we run the macro, we have to choose the case. We're doing this for the residential case. The macro generates this table showing the electricity bill for the with and without system, and then also the present value of costs. So you can get a sense of, you can compare the electricity bill savings to the project costs for with and without. And if you're modeling a system with batteries, then there's a third column here that shows the system with batteries as well. So you got renewable energy system without batteries, with batteries, and no system at all. You can run the macro. Let's say we want the without system scenario to have a complicated rate structure. So if we do that, now it's going to walk me through downloading a rate data from the OpenEI database. So I'll just pick one here. So now the with and without system are for two complicated rate structures. All right, that's all I had to sort of trying to cover all of the bases in working with electricity rates in SAM. And with that, we'll open it to Q&A. Feel free to type a question, or at this point, if you want, you can raise your hand in the webinar widget, and we can unmute your line if you want to ask a question by voice.
Paul, we had someone who was wondering if you could demonstrate again how to download the load data from OpenEI for a commercial system.
Download, yes, okay. So that's via a macro. So if you have a commercial case and go to macros, you should see a macro here called download electric load data. Now, if you have a residential case, you won't see that macro. Oh, it is there. Oh, this is for, yeah, a different, so I'm a little out of date with myself. So there is residential load data in the OpenEI database now. So you can do this for either residential or commercial systems. But so for the commercial situation, then we go to download electric load. First, make sure that the weather file is for the location that you intend to model. Then choose a commercial building type, a McDonald's, for example, and then click Run Macro. And if it says Success, then go to the load page, and you can see the data that it downloaded.
We had a couple other questions, Paul, about how to incorporate various taxes into the electricity rates that might be worth just mentioning sort of more broadly. One of the questions was whether or not the rates that you download from the utility rate database already include taxes. And in some ways that depends on how it was entered into the database. So the SAM team doesn't maintain that database. And so if it was entered with the taxes included, for instance, if they were sort of designated on the rate sheet as part of the rate, then probably they are included. But if they're somehow specified in a footnote or something else a little funky, they might not be included. And we typically recommend, as I think Paul mentioned, that you can download the rate, but you can also double check it against the current rate sheet. So that's probably a good thing to do, especially if you have questions about taxes. And another related question was that if you know your price per kilowatt from a utility and there's a tax on top of it, we would typically just incorporate that tax directly into the rate itself. So instead of, say, it was a 25% tax, instead of being 10 cents a kilowatt hour, you would type in that it's 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So there are different ways that you can incorporate taxes into the rates directly so that they do get accounted for in the cash flow in SAM. Anything you'd like to add to that, Paul?
No, that's great. Thanks, and thanks you guys for answering all the questions, typing away there. Yeah, I think just to reiterate what Janine said, I would consider downloading the rate data from OpenEI as starting point. So get your data in there, and then have a look at the rate sheet and make sure you understand how it was translated, in case there may be some differences in interpretation between the folks who did the data processing for OpenEI and how you'd want to handle it, or for whatever other reason. And I would also note that if you encounter data issues with the OpenEI data, that you can use the OpenEI community to communicate with them.
Looks like we have a couple of hands raised that we might be safe to head over to now.
Okay. I'm not seeing hands raised. I see question marks for people who type questions, I think.
Oh, sorry. We got confused there with the meeting. Another question that might be worth touching on is someone was interested in being able to use the residential or commercial financial models but upload their own PV generation data from another program. And so I had mentioned the generic system option. I don't know if you want to mention that real quick.
Sure. So I'm just creating a new case here by clicking Add. And then I'm going to go to the generic system model and residential. And here on the power plant page, I hope your PV system is not insulted by being called a power plant, but choose the user-specified generation profile, and then click Edit Data, and you can import the generation profile from whatever other source you have. And then that would be coupled with the rates and loads and financial parameters. If you use that method, the cost structure is a little different than, it's a sort of a general generic cost structure, but it works perfectly fine.
We'd had another question that I believe was getting at the point you made earlier about making sure that your location and your load data match up. And they were mentioning, wondering what year the resource file is for. So maybe just worth mentioning that the files that ship with SAM and the TMY that Paul showed downloading are typical years. If you have your load data for a specific year, you can download specific year data for a certain range of years from the NSRDB so that your resource data and load data are not only spatially in the same spot, but also time-wise they're concurrent.
Yeah, so this is worth a little discussion, I think. If you're sort of just focused in on electricity bill calculations, and you're just looking at 1 year and not looking at the cash flow, then it makes sense to match up. You know, if you've got load data from 2014, then you can match it up with a weather file from 2014, and then you should see correlation between you know, cooling loads and high temperatures in the weather file, and get some real interesting detailed insights into how that affects the rate modeling. If you're doing cash flow modeling and you're kind of looking at this project from a project perspective, and looking at things like net present value and payback period, then you just have to be careful about the data. If you're going to base that on a single year, then you're not accounting for variation that is likely to happen over that 25-year period. The typical year weather files are designed to represent a long historical period, and so that, you know, you can think of them as a sort of an average weather profile over a long-term period. So, you know, you might want to use a similar average load profile to do that cash flow calculation. So these are things to be aware of as you're sort of considering what data to use as input, and also as you're analyzing your results and deciding how to interpret them.
Good points on that, Paul. There were a couple of questions about modeling third-party PPAs and solar leases. So maybe just a good time to point out, as Paul's demonstrating now, that the residential and commercial models are for if you are owning the system, but we have this third-party ownership model that allows you to model as if you were leasing the system instead. And there's a separate webinar on that that's available on the SAM website on the webinars page.
All right. We've got a few minutes left. We'll wait and see if any other questions bubble up. I will mention again that we will be posting a recording of this webinar along with a copy of the presentation slides. I tried to make a set of slides that illustrate the steps that I demonstrated so that you can use the slides as a kind of a guide. So that will be available. And then we'll also post the questions and answers, so they're available as references as well. And you'll be able to find those materials from this page. We'll add a link in the list of recordings of past webinars. I see a question there about the selection of excess energy. Maybe that'll be our last question. I think these options here are meant to represent different types of net metering and feed-in tariffs and various other methods of accounting for excess generation. And those it depends on where you are, whether those are determined by the utility or usually by some other regulating company. So, there might be in the U.S., there might be state regulatory documents that describe how excess generation is allowed to be credited, and that determines what the utility is allowed to do. So it's typically not determined by the utility, at least in the U.S., but there's a lot of different things going on, both in the U.S. and around the world with that question, so it might be handled differently in some different places. All right, with that, I think we will call it a day, or at least an hour. Thank you all very much for participating in today's webinar and for asking great questions. We look forward to hearing from you. Please feel free to get in touch with us either through the SAM support forum, or you can email us using the contact form on the SAM website. We're always happy to hear any kind of feedback, or if you have questions about how to do something, just let us know and we'll do what we can to help. So thank you again, and have the rest of a great rest of your day or evening, and look forward to hearing from you sometime soon. Goodbye.